Okay, thank you, speaker. Thank you for this amazing speech. And I have
amazing. Wow.
Yeah. Oh, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Gina, and I'm from National Taiwan Normal University. I major in geography. So last semester, I take a class which is called geography, African geography. So I put some focus on this part of studies. And I have 3 questions. The first one is, what are the main areas in Africa that China puts more focus on? Because we know that there are 55 countries in Africa, and I'm wondering that which part of Africa does China put more focus on it? And the second one is do you think that this kind of action is China want to get close to developing countries and it want to like show its position in the globe, or want to like pose threat to America or something? And the third question is it's a little bit sensitive. That is the relationship between Taiwan and China. What do you think? And what do you think about that Thai government's policy, which is called New Southbound Policy? Do you know that?
I don't know. The Taiwan government
New
policy.
Southbound Policy. Yeah, it's governmentized policy, and it wants people to put more focuses on Eastern South Asia, yeah, and want students and some industries going to East Southern Asia. Yeah. Thank you.
You're naughty, aren't you? All right. First question. In Africa, China's main focus, even though this investment and those numbers I gave you, the statistics are huge, it's actually not scattered equally among the countries. In fact, about 6 or 8 countries get the bulk of that money. You know, you're looking at Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa, I think are the main ones. Nigeria gets a fair amount. And then there are countries below that Africa sends minerals to China. Angola is very huge up there because they have a lot of oil. But if you start looking around, there are a lot of countries that aren't getting much. You know, Rwanda would like some more than they're getting. They've promised to take this rail line that was built all the way to Uganda, so that into Rwanda, so that Rwanda then can get to the coast, because it's kind of landlocked at the moment. But you know, they haven't actually come up with any deals yet. So there are a lot of smaller countries that are waiting for their share of the pie. So most of it's going to Djibouti is the other one. Djibouti, Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa, Kenya. So they're getting actually the bulk of all the money going in there. Your second question was which one now? Remind me again.
Do you think that this kind of action is that China tried to pose threats to America?
Posing a threat to America. You know, again, as I tried to say, you know, I think China does look. China's looking out for China's interests, and I don't think, you know, America's not rivaling China in Africa as much. But China doesn't have any allies anywhere. You know, China if it wants to be a global power as its ambition, you have to have strategic allies. Look, one of the things that makes America a great power, besides its Hollywood movies and exports of McDonald's and Coke, is the fact that it has alliances. It has the NATO alliance, which is huge. It has the alliance with Japan. It has the alliance with Korea. You know what? You know, China has one strategic ally, North Korea. That's it. That's China's only ally. It's the only place it has a strategic alliance with. That's what I meant earlier when I said people want China's money, but I don't see people jumping into alliances with China. And so I think they would love to change that. I think just on a short-term basis, they would love to have a block of African countries that might vote with China at the United Nations, for example. You know, if ever a question came up regarding Taiwan, for example, you know, if they could guarantee they got 40 or 50 votes out of the African bloc, that's a huge bloc right there out of the total number of countries in the world. And in terms of China's relations with Taiwan, look, I mean, it's that's your naughty question. You know, I haven't been here long enough to talk too much about the relationship across the strait, but look, I can tell you this. You know, I've written stories about. Let me go backwards first. When I was in Hong Kong in the 90s, covering Hong Kong's handover to China, I was writing then that if China managed the handover of Hong Kong well, that might make it more likely that people in Taiwan would see that there's a possibility for them coming up with some way to rejoin the mainland. Given what's happening in Hong Kong now, I see the two sides growing further apart politically, not closer together politically. We were all thinking back in the time, and I'll admit like those Americans who I say their view has shifted of China, my view has shifted as well. In the 90s, I was saying, you know, in 20, 25 years, China is going to be a completely different place. It's going to be more democratic. It's going to be more open. And so we shouldn't worry about the eventual unification because Taiwan and China will be not so far apart politically. I said that 20, 25 years ago. You know, I was wrong, and I'll be willing to admit I was wrong. So, yeah, they are far apart politically. On the other hand, I see the economies of the two more closely intertwined than ever before. One of the things when I was living in Shanghai in 2009, 2010, one of the things I noticed was the huge number of Taiwanese there, the huge number of Taiwanese businesses in mainland China, the back and forth ties. Now, interestingly enough, that was something that your former president, Lee Teng-hui, used to warn about. He used to warn that if you had air linkages and sea linkages and all these other links between the two, that eventually Taiwan would become too dependent, in his words, on the mainland. And sure enough, I remember, you know, because I covered Southeast Asia first in the 80s, and Taiwan's main economic ties in this region were with Southeast Asia, not with the mainland. The mainland ties only came much later, but now I think it's too late to kind of turn around and reverse that because the two economies, mainland's and Taiwan's economy, are so closely interlinked. You know, whether that economic linkage is eventually going to lead to a political melding of the two sides, I don't see how that can happen given how far apart they are politically, but just people to people. You know, when I was in Beijing before, to get to Taiwan was basically, it took you all day. You had to fly down to Hong Kong and then change planes and fly over to Taiwan. You know, now I think there's like 50 flights a day between mainland cities and Taiwan. So again, it's growing, the people-to-people ties are growing closer together, economic ties are growing closer together, but politically I see them as far apart as ever.
For time limit, I think we can only take 3 more questions.
Oh yeah, one from the side. Hi.
Thank you very much. I'm Albin Mauritz from Austria. I have one question. There is another power in this area, which is India. India was very strong in Africa. I remember being in Kenya, more than 50% of the Kenyan economy was Indian owned. They pushed out.
Oh.
My question is too long, apparently. Are they pushed out by China now, India, and how do you see the relation of America and India? Are they trying to make another alliance with India, which could be useful?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Great question about India, because I think we ignore India too much, and I think the United States has ignored India too much over the years. I mean, you know, it's interesting, you know, we keep talking about over the years, I've seen this since the 90s, where American businesses especially were always kind of salivating over getting into the China market, saying, you know, it's 1 billion people. You know, if you want to sell anything to China, think about 1 billion people. You could sell 1 billion toothbrushes, or, you know, if you want to sell underarm deodorant, you have 2 billion armpits, they used to say. But everybody forgot about India. India is also 1 billion people, and India is also a democracy. Yeah, that's the thing. India is a democracy as well. So people, I mean, in the Indian market, I think the reason people didn't think about India so much was because that market was actually very, very closed. But lately, the Indian market has actually been opening up quite a bit. And I think it started a bit under Obama, or it actually started under George W. Bush and Obama more. But I think Trump actually is pushing more now for more of an opening towards India, you know, as well. And Modi has kind of pushed that relationship. So I think India is a player that we don't pay as much attention to that we should. They're now starting to talk about, if you notice this coming out of Washington now, the Trump administration are starting to talk about the Indo-Pacific region. They used to only talk about the Pacific. You know, even Obama with his this pivot to Asia only talked about the Pacific. But by talking about the Indo-Pacific, they're actually adding India into it. And I think they see India as kind of a counterweight to China, both economically, militarily, et cetera, in this part of the world. So I think India is a real key player. Some of the numbers I mentioned, you remember I said in terms of direct foreign investment, you know, still the UK, US, and France were the main players, and 30 billion was China, was way down there. China's about the same level as India. Now, you know, I think there is a rivalry going on between India and China. India's got a lot more historic links there. You know, on the eastern part, especially, you know, Tanzania, Kenya, where I lived, a lot of the businesses there are Indian owned. There's huge Indian diaspora there. South Africa, you know, on the eastern coast as well. So I think there is a huge Indian population there, and I think India could be a huge player in the future there. So I think that's a great question.
If anyone from the audience would like to share their experience in Africa or his different opinion on the theme that we are having, we're also welcome. But the young lady over there just raised her hand.
Hi, my name is Kathy, and I'm studying in Jeonju University, and I major in political science, and I study for Africans politics. And I have a question is, do leaders in Africans have capability and willingness to diversify their investment, not to trap into like debt trap for in China, or they have willingness or capability to do this like strategic investments? And the second one is, how do you view the future in the African? Will it come to more close to Chinese model or Western model? Thank you.
Great question. Well, one thing I can't do is predict which model they're going to go closer to. As I mentioned, I think the Chinese would like to, without openly saying it, like to present what they're doing in their country as a model of how you can have one-party government or authoritarian, firm government with economic, and nationalistic government that keeps its economy closed to outsiders but still grow. I think they see that as an alternative to a democratic model. I think, it kind of gets to the earlier question: are African leaders capable? I think there are some leaders that are fully capable of knowing what's going on and not letting the wool be pulled over them. I would say. I mean, Africans are fiercely, jealous of their independence, and they're not going to let anybody, including China, come in and take over their natural resources. There's a new phrase I found lately called it's called resource nationalism. Where they're going to say, they're going to let you come in and do mining, but they're going to own the mines. They're going to make you leave some of the profits from the mining in the country. So so I think they're actually, quite smart about that. But the part of it is getting good enlightened leaders in and getting rid of people like Mugabe who stick around too long. There are a couple of others who call themselves president for life, who don't want to go anywhere. I think you got to get rid of those guys, who have been just hanging around too long, and get in some real leaders who have popular support, or at least who are willing to put themselves up for the voters for legitimizing elections every once in a while. Get rid of the guys who just want to plunder their country's bank accounts and open Swiss bank accounts. Get rid of some of those guys. And I think, there are plenty of enlightened people there. They have to be given a chance to rise up. But I think and the future, I think, is positive in general. As I said, this infrastructure being built is terrific. I was in South Africa, I think last November or December or so, and I was absolutely amazed at, the progress that's being made because of, the Chinese investment, the cell phone systems that are going into place, the internet. Don't forget the digital infrastructure, which is as important as anything else. That's all being done by China. It's not being done by Western countries. So I think there is a positive future.
The lady over there, in the middle, in white, right?
Thank you, Mr. Richberg. I had the opportunity to have lived in Africa and worked there, also as a consultant at the World Bank. I have 3 questions. So following up on that previous questions, how do you see or the African government or their civil society can actually empower their own people to kick out, quote unquote, their corruptive presidents, leaders, etc. I'm asking this because you mentioned the example in Malaysia, because of such a regime change, that they had the opportunity to actually get rid of those projects that's not favorable to them. And second question, how do you see the African diaspora? I believe there are a lot of them in southern China in particular. What do you see is their role in, and do you see they're going back to their home country first? And second, what do you see as their role in voicing their learnings or experiences and other opinions, to bridge the conversation between Africa and China? And last question, are most of the Chinese SMEs state-sponsored, or are they purely based on the owner's individual commercial interests that they actually start their business in Africa? Thank you.
All good questions. The last one was the easiest. I think for the small and medium businesses going to Africa, I think, I couldn't give you the exact numbers, but I think most are going on their own, but they were encouraged to go by the government, which said, go abroad. I mean, I remember that was under Hu Jintao. that he before Xi Jinping, who told he told companies, go out, go abroad, go places. So a lot of them are just going because they'll go anywhere where you can make money, and that's a place where you can go make money. Interestingly enough, too, I see a lot of the and this kind of relates to your second question about the diaspora. A lot of our students are from mainland China. About 50% of our Masters of Journalism students come from mainland China. I find it fascinating that many of them tell me that they've already been to Africa on their own. They didn't go as some part of some government-sponsored Peace Corps type of thing. They just thought it was interesting, and they just packed up and went. And they go there, they work in, they get jobs working in schools, doing NGO type work, et cetera, and then they come back, really interested and excited about what's going on there. So that's interesting for me. It's a whole new generation of young Chinese who, number one, don't just go out on package tours, but they're going off on their own and wanting to see and explore on their own in Africa. And but the diaspora and the biggest Chinese city is Guangzhou, that has a huge African population there. They call it Chocolate City, this whole area in the middle of it, which is almost all African traders there. A lot of them are staying there. A lot of them are getting married and living there. You can go to these churches on Sunday that are almost all African. They're having children there. Interesting, one of the things it's doing is it's changing China's perceptions of Africans, I think, to have so many mixed marriages. China is a pretty homogenous place with a lot of Han-Chinese, right? But now that you have this African diaspora there in Guangzhou, it's slowly, and again, I say slowly, but changing kind of perceptions of people as they integrate more into the population and community there. I think that's really interesting. Your first question was about, remind me again. Oh, yeah, yes. Yeah, exactly. Look, I think one of the more exciting things in Africa lately, since I've been there, because somebody asked about my book, was 20 years ago, one of the most exciting things there is this growth of civil society movements, which I think is fantastic. And that's been helped along a lot, I think, by social media, by Facebook, and by these new media startups, which didn't exist kind of when I was there. And again, if you want to know how you can have that kind of popular mobilization that leads to change, as happened as we saw in Malaysia, new media startups is one of the things. I was watching the Malaysian elections with my wife. It was kind of fascinating how when there was a rumor that ballot boxes were being stolen in some area, these websites like Malaysia Kini could tell people, hey, get over here and protect the ballot boxes. The idea that people can communicate with each other in a heartbeat and mobilize people to go protect their election and protect ballot boxes, keep Najib's plane from leaving if people think he's going to leaving. That's the sort of thing I think is really exciting now. It's hard to steal elections now when you have a lot of people watching and a lot of people who can communicate with each other and mobilize. I saw it earlier, years ago in the Philippines when it was just being done by cell phone. But now, people are out there with their iPhones filming things, filming ballots. You can actually follow ballots now in boxes as they're making their way from a village to the city. It's harder to do. People can still steal votes, but it's harder to have hanky-panky now when there's so much social media around. I think it's one of the more exciting things. Did we miss some Facebook?
No. We only have 10 more minutes, so please raise your hands, and maybe I'll ask Keith to answer all in. So we'll have the question first.
Hi, my name is Shelley, and I'm a student from University of Taipei. I have two questions. First is going off of what you said about living in Hong Kong and working in the media industry. I have a question about how Hong Kong and Taiwan are the forefronts of Chinese United Front Force, and how there are political and media infiltrations in those areas. So what are your perspectives on that topic, and what are your recommendations for Taiwan to cope with that? The second question is, some critics in the international relations field said that the relationship between China and US is a formation of a new Cold War. Do you agree with that, and what are your perspectives on that? Thank you.
Okay, I have to take another two questions.
I work in the U.S. the past year for NGO for refugees, so I'm more concerned about the human rights issue, because the coworker in the U.S., they believe that the Africans like China more than U.S. because China gives them money and construction, but U.S. sends NGOs over there and try to shift their social structure about women empowerment or refugees, and it's making their society not that stable because they are not that respectful for like LGBT or women's. So that's their perspective, and I just want to know how you feel about that, and will China have any influence on refugees? Thank you.
Which society was it?
Huh?
Where was it? Which society you said was?
Like Africa in general.
Africa in general.
Yeah, because the countries I work with the most, it's the Congo and Sudan. These two are the main refugees we have over there. Thank you.
Okay. Do we find another question over in the back?
Hi, I'm Belinda, and thank you for the inspiring speech. I have a question related about Taiwan's last ally in Africa, and you mentioned in the speech during the speech that economic investment is not always transferred into influence. But we all know that China has the ambition about taking over Taiwan's last ally in Africa, that's Switzerland, and especially that Switzerland is rely heavily on economic on South Africa and Mozambique, and both of them are China's diplomatic allies. So what's your point of view about this? Thank you.
Okay, there's two more questions from the iPad we are broadcasting. One is that Xi Jinping just announced there's another 60 billion of aid to Africa. Would that eventually, those kind of support and aid will cause financial problem even for China? And the other question is more related with the journalists that you have been teaching. And in the digital age, what kind of challenge would that be for the new comer for journalists?
Mm-hmm. Okay, good questions. Let me see if I can remember everything. First, in terms of the United Front forces that you were asking about, I mean, that's long been a problem. I mean, not just recently in Hong Kong and Taiwan that there have been these, these insidious forces, if you want to call them that. It's probably a bigger problem in Taiwan because Hong Kong is a part of China now. So these forces don't need to be operating underground; they can be operating above ground now. There's pro-China forces that have always kind of been there. And a lot of them are engaged, but I mean, again, it's kind of information warfare, and it's always an open, it's an open battle, if you want to call it disinformation warfare or whatever it is. I can't say I don't have any answer on how you combat it, because the U.S. is having this problem now where you've got Russian forces that are coming in and using the media and using Facebook and using social media to spread disinformation, try to incite groups against each other, try to stir things up. We haven't figured out the answer to that either, because we don't want to close down social media. We don't want to close down, Facebook. So they're hoping that the media can regulate itself. To me, the answer is just in news literacy. It's in the public has to know when they're reading something that this is propaganda or this is coming from a source, et cetera. So I think the real answer is we all need to, government, journalism schools need to invest more in news literacy programs so that the audiences know when they're reading something, whether it's real or whether it's propaganda, whether it's Russian disinformation or Chinese government disinformation, et cetera. We have a big news literacy project in our university in Hong Kong. We go around for a lot of conferences talking about this. Did you ask if there's going to be a new Cold War between the United States and China? I don't necessarily know if I would call it a Cold War. Where the U.S. and China, the U.S. and Russia during the real Cold War were pointing missiles at each other, and they basically came, they came very close to confrontation during things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, et cetera. I don't see this current situation, this kind of strategic rivalry with China, as a new Cold War. I see it basically as we've never been in a situation before, except once that I can remember, where a global power has ceded its position on the world stage and handed over global leadership to another power. The only time one time we've actually seen it is when Britain handed over kind of global leadership to the United States after World War II. But again, those were two countries that had a natural alliance and were close to each other. Usually the power that's declining doesn't want to leave the world stage, and the new power rising has to push it off the world stage. You know, it's happened with Britain pushing Spain off, et cetera, et cetera. You can go back to the Roman Empire. We don't know how this is going to turn out between the United States and China. I think it's a bit further off than people think. I mean, China's a huge economic power. Militarily, they're still way behind the United States. Culturally, in terms of soft power, et cetera. But I do think there is that, we're at that moment where, you know, the U.S. has had this global leadership role now for, you know, I don't know, 100 years, but it's losing that position now. China is rapidly coming up, but we've got a democratic country that's kind of being pushed down, and the rising power that's coming up is a non-democratic authoritarian country. We'll have to see how that plays itself out. Human rights, I've not heard actually China ever expressing much interest in the refugee situation, et cetera, in terms of, you know, China's interest is not really to get involved in the internal affairs, whether it's in refugee camps or in countries that are involved there, whether it be in LGBT rights or anything else. They just don't talk about it. You know, they just say that they stay out of countries' internal affairs. Western countries in the United States specifically, they have a habit of we send in a lot of people. We send in missionaries. We send in people to lecture them about all kinds of things, right and left. I mean, that's just kind of part of, you know, what the United States does. I mean, it's you know, we see ourselves as this proselytizing power. We're one of the only powers in the world. Even the Europeans don't do that to the same extent, where we like to push our values on other people around the world, because, you know, we're a country that was come together around this common set of values. We weren't a common people. You know, we don't have a common history. We come from all over the place. So the only thing we have in common are our values, free speech, human rights, et cetera. So we always felt that that's our mission, to go around the world and teach that to others. So yeah, so that's one of the failures. But I mean, that's just what Americans do, and I think people kind of put up with us, you know, whether they like it or not. In terms of, yeah, look, I mean, there's been this competition. I understand Taiwan has lost like 4 or 5 countries over the last year or two. Panama, Dominican Republic, was El Salvador the most recent one. Look, I mean, it's inevitable to me that, you know, China's huge on the world stage. I think the question is not whether countries switch their diplomatic recognition, but if they keep some kind of a presence in Taiwan and recognize that Taiwan is still a major economic player as well, the same as the United States did. And I found it amazing when I was just reading that the U.S. is thinking of punishing some of these Latin American countries that shifted their diplomatic relations to China from Taiwan. I'm saying, well, wait a minute, you did the same thing, right? How could you possibly punish El Salvador and Panama for switching their diplomatic relations? So as I said, it's not really, to me, it's whether or not, you know, you say, look, we're going to recognize China because China is huge. It's a huge world player, but we're still going to maintain our relations with Taiwan. You know, I don't see why that couldn't happen. And it doesn't have to be we're going to cut off Taiwan. It just means they're going to shift the relationship. And you were asked about the $60 billion in aid more recently. You know, I'm still waiting to see how that divides up between concessionary loans or grants or loans that have to be repaid or low interest loans. So, and also, you know, a lot of these things in Beijing get announced with great fanfare, but then you have to wait a few weeks to see whether the money actually comes down. A lot of it's often just really promises. Yes. Well, that's the most interesting thing was after this announcement in Beijing about the $60 million, the netizens, the Chinese internet users started complaining, hey, hold on a second, our economy is slowing down. Why are you spending $60 billion in Africa? Why aren't you spending that here at home in China? And I actually saw that when I was there some years ago when China was sending school buses overseas, and some people started complaining about their own school buses were run down and needed to be fixed. So just recently, a couple days ago, they actually had to shut off this internet debate because it was being so critical about China for being overextending itself in Africa. So that, look, it's the exact same kind of question that a lot of people had that led to the support for Donald Trump. When Donald Trump was going around saying, why are we spending this money rebuilding Afghanistan? Why are we spending this money rebuilding Iraq? Why aren't we rebuilding Detroit and Cleveland and Oakland? So I think a lot of people in China are going to start saying the same thing. They're saying, look, China's still, you know, in many ways a developing country. If you go outside of Beijing and Shanghai to some of the 3rd-tier cities or 4th-tier cities, you see a lot of poverty. Yeah, they need a lot of help there too. So a lot of people don't understand China's kind of global ambitions. They think, wait a minute, it's too early for China to be going out and extending onto the global stage. Build up the country first. Follow what Deng Xiaoping said. You know, go slowly at first and don't show your strength.
Finally, for those people who want to join the journalist career, and we are facing with the new and digital age. What were your recommendations?
Well, this has never been a more exciting time, I think, to be a journalist. There's so much going on in the world. And I think, I tell my students every year when they arrive that it's incredibly exciting. It's a great job. You're never going to make much money. You're probably not going to make a whole lot of friends. But boy, it's really, it's much more fun than being an accountant. And I'll tell you, the other thing is that the barrier to entry to journalism now is lower than it's ever been. Because you may not do what I did. You may not get hired by the Washington Post and Bob Woodward and work for the next 34 years for a great American newspaper. But these days, I had to wait for the Washington Post to send me overseas. These days, you can, if you got a laptop and a good cell phone plan, you could just take yourself over to where something is happening and start writing and start blogging and set up your own website. And as news organizations start cutting down on the number of foreign correspondents, as they're doing, that's opening up all kinds of opportunity for you guys. Go out and go places. Just go there and start doing it, and they'll take your stories. But, the tools of the trade haven't changed. You still have to be a good storyteller. You still have to recognize a good story and be able to tell a great story. And there is an appetite for that out there. And look, as I said, you may not do what I did. You may not have, 30 years working for one big company. But God, you can set up your own website. You can become a blogger. You can do all kinds of things to just get out there and start telling stories of the world. Because God knows there's more information coming at us than ever before, but most of it's not really giving us the context that we really need and telling us the background and the detail that people are really craving out here.
I want to thank all of you for your participation and your question. But let us give a big hand for Keith.
Thank you.
And that will wrap up with our session today. Thank you very much for attending.